The Edmonton Oilers might not start their first round series against the Los Angeles Kings until Monday, but here is everything you need to know going into the weekend.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your interim host, Nick Zararis. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Monopoly Go. I admit it, I'm pretty competitive. I'm a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on a classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. So today's episode, we are going to approach this episode as a series primer, not directly a preview, because we are going to touch base with Eddie Garcia of Locked On Kings over the weekend, and we are then going to have a more traditional crossover. We'll get some Kings perspective. We'll talk a little bit more open-endedly. Today's episode is going to be similar energy-wise to Thursday's episode, where we talked about things conceptually, how the Oilers style would translate to the postseason, how that fits in regards to the rest of the NHL. And this series is one we've seen before. So first segment today, we're going to touch on just the big picture, drop-down view, what the regular season tells us about these two teams, what recent history tells us about these two teams, and what the series might look like. We're going to touch on some of the key matchups and some of the decisions that both head coaches are going to have to make. And then our last segment, we're going to talk about why the Oilers should be able to take care of business. So, getting right on into it. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to picture being in middle school gym class. For some people, I know that's a horrifying premise, but imagine we're playing ball hockey in gym class, and we're going to line up the Los Angeles Kings and the Edmonton Oilers along the line, and we're going to pick from the pools of players, and we're going to make our teams. The simple answer to this question I'm about to ask, who's the first pick, is silly. The answer to the question, who is the second pick, is also silly. The Oilers have the two best players in this series. I can make an argument that Zach Hyman and Evan Bouchard might go before anybody on the Kings. And that's not a knock on anyone on the Kings. I really like the season Anze Kopitar had. Drew Doughty has reinvented himself in his mid-30s as a defense-first defenseman that better suits where the Kings are as a team now. And he's had a really nice season. Evan Bouchard's better than Drew Doughty. That's not a controversial take. If you wanted to take Kopitar before Zach Hyman, sure. I would have no qualms with making that decision. No, Zach Hyman was better this season. And then it starts to get interesting. You know, you talk about, would you rather Ryan Nugent-Hopkins or Adrian Kempe? Would you rather Kevin Fiala or a healthy Evander Kane? Would you rather Kevin Fiala or Warren Foegele? You know, there are a lot of options here once you get further down the lineup. The funny question is, which goalie is going to get picked first? And we're going to touch on the goaltending a little bit later on. But that would arguably be the most contentious decision you'd have to make if you were to line these two teams up to pick them from them, is which goalie are you going to take? Are you going to take Stuart Skinner or are you going to take Cam Talbot? Ultimately, especially in the early rounds of the playoffs, I am going to take the high-end guys. Generally speaking, that's how I decide who I'm picking in a series, is if we line up each team's best guys and we put them head-to-head, who's more likely to win? And I know that's not exactly a revolutionary process for deciding what team I think is better, but the Oilers' ceiling is winning the Stanley Cup because of their high-end talent. The Kings' ceiling, even if they beat the Oilers, is probably the conference final, just because I don't think they would be able to beat whoever comes out of the Central, whether it's Dallas, Winnipeg, Colorado, or I know Vegas isn't in the Central, but they are on the Central side of the bracket. So with that in mind, let's look at the history. These two teams have met in the first round each of the previous two seasons. The Oilers have lost game one in both of those series. In 2023, they were up 3-1 in the third period, and they eventually lost that game in overtime. Stuart Skinner had an .890 save percentage. Jack Campbell came in relief a couple of times. It was ugly, but the Oilers were able to take care of it, and they went to the second round. 2 years ago, Oilers lose game one. They had an overtime loss in there, and then a lot of blowouts. There was an 8-2, there was a 6-0, weird scores in there that aren't really indicative of playoff hockey. Generally speaking, you don't see lopsided scores like that because the style of play is different. Generally speaking, in the playoffs, the games are going to be lower scoring because teams are a little more reticent to take risks, and risk taking has an inherent positive impact where the riskier plays you make, generally speaking, those risky plays are typically more likely to result in goals eventually. So for the purposes of this conversation, I don't think there's a world where you can make a serious argument that the Kings can win this in 4 or 5 games. I don't think the Kings can win this series in 6 games. And when we're talking this out, when we're game theorying it out, we're trying to think about all the permutations. Some team is going to win this series with 4 games. They're going to win 4. Are they going to win it in 4, 5, or 6, or 7? Okay. Which team is going to win in which outcome? So the Oilers can win this series, realistically, in my estimation, in 5, 6, or 7 games. The Kings can only win this series in 7 games. I don't think there's a world where the Kings are going to be able to make that kind of difference, to have that much of a gap between them and the Oilers over a 7-game series where they're going to be able to win 4-1 or 4-2. How do the Kings pull off the upset? And this will be a nice way to segue because we can talk about the big picture, and this will segue nicely into our second segment where we're going to talk about some of the key matchups and decisions. The Kings are going to need to prolong this series. They need this series to go 7 games if they are going to win, because they do not have more talent than the Oilers. They might have more depth throughout their lineup, but if we were to think about talent as a quantifiable asset, like if we could translate talent to a material object you could hold in your hands, the talent of the Oilers would be a more substantial, tangible good than the talent of the Kings, because the talent that the Oilers have at the top of their lineup is otherworldly good. Now, I know some people listening will say, well, Nick, aren't you a person who often takes the team with the better depth over the star power? Yes, I do. Because typically speaking, the way the playoffs go, the high-end talent more or less cancels each other out. Not entirely, in a given game, one team's high-end players are going to win their minutes. But over the course of a series, generally speaking, those two are going to cancel each other out. The goal differential is going to be relatively even, and that leaves it to the bottom 6. And those bottom 6 guys are typically where the offense, the auxiliary, the ancillary, whatever word you want to use to describe it, that additional offense that's going to set them apart. That's where it typically comes from in a series where the top 6 guys are able to match up very well. Now, the Oilers are very strong. The Kings are very strong defensively, and it's going to be incumbent upon the Oilers to kind of break up that structure, to force the Kings to get away from what they've been good at all season. And we're going to talk about some of the decisions they could do that. The Kings, if they are going to win this series, they're going to need a few things. Number one, they're probably going to have to win at least 2 games in overtime. Okay. Overtime, of course, coin flip because it's sudden death. Anything can happen in overtime. The more games you play in overtime, just because you've lost a couple doesn't mean you're likely to win more, or just because you've won a bunch doesn't mean you're less likely to win. That's the inherent randomness of overtime playoff hockey because it is sudden death. If the Kings are going to win the series, they're going to need to win at least 2 in overtime. Depending on the series, my recipe for the upset has been different. If you have the strong goalie, like if you're the Jets, and I know the Jets are a higher seed than the Avalanche, I think the Avalanche are the better team. Connor Hellebuck can steal a game, and he can lead an upset there. If we're going to talk about the Islanders against the Hurricanes, I think Varlamov or Sorokin can steal a game there. I think Vasilevsky can probably steal a game against Florida. And then you get one against Florida, you get one stolen game by your goalie, and you get one overtime win, and you're halfway to 4. The math really becomes more palatable, but to get there, you do need to get to overtime. You do need to keep the game close so that way your goalie playing out of his mind can make a difference. Coming up next, we are going to talk about some of the tactical decisions, meaning personnel, maybe some strategy, some tactics. But first, we are going to take a quick break. One of the most important responsibilities you can have as a provider is looking out for your family. One of the more important ways you can do that is with life insurance. Policygenius is the country's leading online insurance marketplace. It saves you time and money so you can provide your family with a financial safety net starting today. With Policygenius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Policygenius helps you compare your options from all of the major companies, and their experts are on hand to walk you through the process every step of the way, and their tools allow you to compare quotes across the board. You might not know this, but your work life insurance policy might not be as much as your family needs, or even worse, if you switch jobs and change companies, it might not come with you. Check life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policygenius. Head to policygenius.com/lockedonnhl or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/lockedonnhl. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here on the return of Locked On Oilers. This is the third show since I took over on Wednesday of this week, and I'm ecstatic to be here. I'm very happy the Oilers aren't starting their series until Monday because it's going to give me time to amply ramp up my mentality that I'm going to be staying up till 1 a.m. East Coast time for all of these games, and probably, in all honesty, doing a live show as soon as the game is over, instantly reacting with the most important stuff, because that's why you do this. If you're going to do an everyday podcast, everybody who gets up for work in the morning, whether that's 5 a.m., 8 a.m., or if you're working the night shift, 3 or 4 p.m., you need to know what's going on. You want to know what happened in the game. And that's why I'm going to do my best to get a show out as soon as the games end during this first round series. So, second segment, we're going to talk about ideas for matchup, strategy, and tactics. Much has been made about the Kings' frequency, use. Much has been made of the Kings playing a 1-3-1 in the neutral zone. The vast majority of casual hockey fans do not care about tactics. They do not understand tactics because it's not important to them. They get a loose understanding of the flow of a game based on if their team is going to carry the puck into the zone or if they dump it in. That's generally their barometer for understanding how neutral zone play works. A 1-3-1 is a way of minimizing risk for a defense and to make up for a lack of foot speed. When you play a 1-3-1, you're going to have one forechecking forward up a little bit more in the neutral zone. You're going to have 3 defensemen across your blue line, and then you're going to have a trailer. That 1-3-1 is really good at slowing teams down, forcing them to dump the puck in, and that gives your defense time to adjust, to situate, to get their feet under them, turn around, recover the puck, and try and get to offense. That's the ideal outcome for a team running the 1-3-1. The conundrum here, if you're the Kings, is that the Oilers are such a fast team. They play with so much tempo that playing a 1-3-1 might benefit them, because if you consistently are giving them the same look over and over and over again, the Oilers are going to be able to use their speed to ramp this game up. If this series goes the way we think it will for the Oilers, I did pick the Oilers to win on every show I've gone on, and in my series picks for the first round. I think the Oilers are going to win this series. They're going to win this series by outscoring LA. I know the goal of a hockey game, and you can only win a hockey game by scoring more goals than the other team. That's not my point. I mean, they are going to win these games 4-3, 5-4, 6-5. If the Oilers are going to run away with this, if they're going to win in 5 or 6 games, they are going to make the Kings uncomfortable by turning the tempo up, by trying to press, and create as much offense as humanly possible, because the Kings don't have the firepower to keep up with the Oilers offensively. They have a lot of talent, don't get me wrong, and we're going to talk about some of the guys on the Kings to keep an eye out for, guys who, if you're not as familiar with the Kings, or maybe you're a little bit more of a casual regular season fan, but you're excited for the playoffs, we got you covered. The key to me for the Oilers, and I talked about this yesterday in regards to Evan Bouchard and Matthias Ekholm, What happens after those guys come off the ice? And in this case, we're going to talk about it in relation to McDavid and Draisaitl together. We talked about how the Oilers have played about 4,000 minutes of 5-on-5 this year, and they've had at least one of McDavid and Draisaitl on the ice for about 2,000 plus minutes. So a little more than half of the Oilers' minutes at 5-on-5 this year, they've had at least one of McDavid or Draisaitl on the ice. There are maybe 2 or 3 teams in the entire NHL who have a player as good, or in the ballpark. I shouldn't say as good. No player in the NHL is as good as McDavid. I don't care what they say about McKinnon or Matthews or Kucherov or Panarin or Pasternak or whoever. None of those guys is as good as McDavid. I'm sorry. What's going to happen in the minutes McDavid isn't on the ice? That's the key for me in understanding this, in all honesty. I really do think if the Oilers are going to be what we expect them to be, what can they do to make it happen? So you talk about some of the important splits, some of the important decisions. To me, if the Oilers are going to make something happen, they're going to have to be able to play stretches of the game. And when I say make something happen, I'm talking about the playoffs at large, not the first round series against the Kings. In all honesty, I think the Oilers would be more than likely able to get away with playing McDavid and Draisaitl together for most of the series because they're that good. And then as the games go along, they can get a better feel if they need to stick together. I do think that's a great trump card to have if you're down a goal late or it's a tie game late and you want to run those two out there together. That's great. It's a nice luxury to have. But in an ideal world, you would play them separate from each other because that's going to diversify your offensive threat. You heard me talking about in the opening segment this idea that the high-end players more or less cancel each other out. If you spread the high-end players out throughout your lineup, it's harder for the other team to do that because then they have to spread their guys throughout the lineup, but their high-end guys are not as good as yours. McDavid, Kopitar head-to-head, Kopitar will hold his own, but the Oilers, more likely than not, are going to win a good chunk of those minutes. And when I say win, that might not directly mean pucks going into the net, but it does mean possession of the puck. It does mean offensive zone time, and it does mean the Kings aren't on offense. To me, I think the one area I would be concerned as an Oiler fan, the bottom 6 of the Oilers is not as good as the Kings' bottom 6. The Kings have luxuries. They have guys like Alex Lafreniere, guys like Quentin Byfield, who can kind of slot in anywhere, on the younger side of things. Don't forget about Turcotte as well. They can slide any of those 3 guys anywhere. You know, you go look at Daily Faceoff right now. They have Pierre-Luc Dubois as their 4th-line center. He's not going to be their 4th-line center come Monday, but he's going to play in their bottom 6. And if you're going to match up, you know, you're going to be looking at what? Ryan McLeod head-to-head against Pierre-Luc Dubois. I know Dubois has been underwhelming this year, but Pierre-Luc Dubois is a better player. So with that in mind, how are you going to use your matchup advantages? You know, the Oilers are the higher seed. They're the 2 seed. They're going to have last change. You're going to have the option. Do I want to get Bouchard out there with McDavid or with Draisaitl or with someone else? Do I want to try and separate my 3 best players from each other? And that way we can win as many minutes as possible. That is how I strategically like to think about a hockey game, especially a playoff hockey game. If I can separate my number 1 defenseman from my best forward, that's going to cover a good chunk of the game. And they're going to play with each other. But when I say separate, I mean mostly with the other forwards and mostly with the other defensive pairs. That's going to give you a luxury. If I can have McDavid on the ice for 23, 24 minutes, and I can have Bouchard on the ice for 28 minutes, and they overlap for like 8 or 9 of those minutes, that's still, 19 and 15? Yeah, 20. I said 24, 28. I had to do the math for a minute. 19 and 15 minutes away from each other. That's 34 minutes of the game at large where you're going to have at least one of them on the ice. That's great. That's more than half the game. Then you get to add Draisaitl into the mix, and that's another 20 plus minutes of the game. If you separate him from McDavid outright for most of the game, and they both play about 25 minutes, and they overlap for 5 to 6 of them, that's 2/3 of the game where you're going to have probably the best player on the ice at that given moment. We will be back in 1 minute. We'll touch on a little bit more about the Kings' perspective, why I think the Oilers are going to win, Stick around. Guys, I need you to listen up. I've been tracking the leaderboards every day, keeping my eye on the scores, putting my time and effort into it, and I'm pumped to announce I'm finally on top of my group chat's leaderboard. That's right. I'm talking about the mobile hit game, Monopoly Go. You've probably heard of it. It's been downloaded over 150 million times. It's a great mobile twist on classic Monopoly. You can play it anywhere, anytime. You explore hundreds of Monopoly boards from Vegas to Camelot to the moon, all while raking in a fortune. Charge rent on iconic properties, just like the Monopoly you know and love. You can charge your friends rent on those properties or go after their money by pulling off bank heists and taking wrecking balls to their landmarks. My favorite part, the leaderboards, where you can see who's a tycoon, who's gone bankrupt. Get yourself on the charts, download Monopoly Go, now free on the Apple App Store and Google Play. Thank you so much for hanging out on this Friday afternoon. If you are excited for the NHL playoffs, I hope you're subscribed to the channel. Pick the series below. I will leave my series picks in the comments under the video. Let everybody know who I'm picking. Let me know who you think's going to win. You know, we've got Nashville and Vancouver, the Oilers and the Kings. We've got Dallas and Vegas, which should be great, and Winnipeg, Colorado. That series should also be great. Out east, we've got the Rangers and the Capitals. We've got the Battle of Florida between Tampa Bay and the Florida Panthers, the Islanders and the Hurricanes, and then the Bruins and the Leafs going at it again. I cannot wait. The series out west are going to be awesome. This is my favorite time of the year. If you know me, if you're new to knowing me, hello. I'm glad you're along for the ride with me here on Locked On Oilers. This is my favorite time of the year. We had the Masters last weekend. We've got the ramp up of the playoffs of both the NHL and the NBA starting this weekend. We've got the return of the Chinese Grand Prix if you're a Formula One fan. We got NASCAR in full swing. There's so much going on. The NFL draft is next week. Baseball is a couple weeks into the season now. There is just so much going on, and it's a great time to be a sports fan. So, if you're an Oilers fan, you're probably a little worried. Not particularly about this given series, this series against the Kings, but the bigger picture. You understand that this is the best iteration of the Oilers in terms of talent. I don't think that's really a hot take. They have not had a defenseman playing as well as Evan Bouchard has played this season, I would say, since McDavid got there. And I know Darnell Nurse was very good 2 years ago. I know they had one point had Duncan Keith on this team. They had the ghost of Duncan Keith. They did not have Conn Smythe Duncan Keith. Duncan Keith, at his best, one of the 10 best defensemen ever. That was not who the Oilers got. Why the Oilers are going to win this series? They have the two best players in it. Those two guys can move like forces of nature. And I know there are star players all across this league. No team has two players on this tier. I think Colorado's close. I'm putting Rantanen below Draisaitl. I am. It's really that simple for me. And then we start talking about the goaltending. Cam Talbot, who I mentioned in the opening segment, almost blew it for the Kings on Thursday night, last game of the regular season against the Blackhawks. That is not a great look. Really came out of the gate hot, had a really good save percentage and goals saved above expected through mid-December. And then they kind of hit a wall. The Kings hit a lull. They weren't particularly good. They fired their coach. He's been okay in the second half of the season. I was very surprised to see how good Cam Talbot's playoff numbers were, because I just didn't realize, frankly, that he'd been good in the playoffs because of how infrequently it's happened. He's only been to the postseason 3 times. The most recent time was 2 years ago as a member of the Wild, and they lost in 7 games in that series. So he's got a decent save percentage. He's got a decent goal saved above expected. Stuart Skinner, you only need to be average. Stuart Skinner does not need to be great. He doesn't. You can get by in the playoffs with just average goaltending. Stuart Skinner played at an .890 save percentage last year, and the Oilers still won. If he can play 900, 905 save percentage goalie, the Oilers can win this series in 5 or 6 games. It's really that straightforward to me. I think the talent gap in terms of overall cumulative talent, not depth, the Kings are a deeper team. The Oilers' talent is more abundant because of where the talent is concentrated. I know conceptually that might be a bit hard to think about, but you're taking those two guys and building off of that every time. The recent history would indicate a team like the Oilers with the high-end talent is going to beat the team that tries to slow it down, muck it up, and turn it into a rock fight. I do think the Kings are capable. This is not knocking the Kings. This is not making fun of the Kings. They are more than capable of turning this series into something ugly. They are going to do their best Iowa football impression. They are going to play really, really strong defense. They are going to try and wear the Oilers out over the course of a series. There will be shenanigans. The Kings will be engaging in the after the whistle stuff. They will try and goad the Oilers into penalties, especially if Evander Kane comes back. Everybody around the league knows Evander Kane is someone you can rile up and get a reaction out of. But I do think the Oilers are well positioned now. I think avoiding Vegas in round one is favorable. I know we talked about the other day the idea that it didn't really matter who the Oilers played in the first round, because no matter who they played, they were going to be good because the West in general is good. Like, even if they were playing Nashville's not great, but Nashville's a solid hockey team that's going to make the Canucks work. I think the Predators are going to give the Canucks a really hard series. I think that series is going to go 7 games all the way. But this series in particular will come down to 2 things for me. How do the Oilers play in the non-Evan Bouchard, Matthias Ekholm minutes? That's why I think it's important to try and separate Bouchard from McDavid when you can. What's going to happen when that second pair is out there? What's going to happen when Nurse is out there? What's going to happen when CC is out there? What's going to happen when they're down goalie? Can they trust Vincent Desharnais? Is Troy Stetcher going to play? I don't know. How short a bench is Chris Knobloch going to run? I think that's something that's hurt the Oilers in years past, is as they've gone later in playoffs, they've gotten later in series, they ride their top guys a lot. They're capable, but it's taxing. There will be a game in this postseason if the Oilers go on a long run where Draisaitl and McDavid play like 28 minutes for a forward, which is insane. That'll probably be a game that goes to overtime, but it'll happen. I feel very confident that you will see gross time on ice numbers from the Oilers because that's how much they trust their guys. One last thing on this subject before we wrap up and get everybody set for the weekend. I think the Oilers recognize the gravity of the situation in front of them. They understand that Leon Draisaitl will be a free agent on July 1st. They understand Connor McDavid is 2 years away from free agency. The guys on that team understand the gravity of the situation. They made the conference finals a couple years ago. That was nice. You always want to make the playoffs as many times as you possibly can. It's important. You want to make the playoffs as many times as you can because that is the formula for eventually capturing the Stanley Cup. You look through recent history of the Stanley Cup winners. Last year, Vegas, they've been in the playoffs 5 of the 6 years of their existence, and they won a cup. Colorado made the playoffs 4 or 5 of the previous 6 seasons before. Here, I'm gonna do the right thing and pull it up so I get my numbers right. The Avalanche had made the playoffs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They had made the playoffs 4 straight years before they won the Stanley Cup. Before that, Tampa Bay was in the playoffs, every year but one from 2013 through 2023. And the one year they were out of it was a year where pretty much everybody was hurt. They made the playoffs consistently for the better part of the decade. We talk about the St. Louis Blues. They made the playoffs pretty consistently for the better part of a decade. They missed the playoffs the year before they won the Cup, but they made the playoffs the 6 previous seasons. We talk about Washington. The Capitals finally were able to break through with not a particularly strong iteration of their team, but they made the playoffs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Of the 10 seasons including the Stanley Cup, they made the playoffs 9 times. The Oilers have been consistently making the playoffs for a few years now. You probably would have liked to have had one more deep run prior to this year, just for the probabilities of it all, because generally speaking, these teams that go all the way, they have a couple of those heartbreaking losses before they find the exact right recipe. That's the thing. The main course of the Oilers is perfect. they've been trying to iron out the dessert and the espresso after. I think the Oilers are more than capable of making something magical happen this year, but they're on the margins. On the margins is the hardest place to improve because it's negligible. It's little details that are going to change outcomes for franchises and the league at large. But that will just about do it on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcasts. Leave the show 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, subscribe, hit the like button. Yes, that's my face. Yes, that's Money in the Bank. Cody Rhodes should watch his back. Let me know who you think is going to win the different playoff series in the comments. I will talk to you guys on Monday with Eddie. Until then, enjoy your weekend. Let's go Oilers.